Now, I have loved the book of Ruth since I was very little, and I was introduced to it in a way that it was like the rom-com of the Old Testament, okay? You've got love, you've got intrigue, you've got will they, won't they, you've got a potentially dodgy character that you're like, is she gonna end up with that guy? But most importantly, and this is a little spoiler, everyone lives happily ever after. It's a good story. But it's effectively a story about a normal person that does normal things and then, life happens. And so maybe the question becomes, why are we talking about her? And honestly, the more that I studied Ruth as I got older, the more I realized that it's not just one story about one girl who meets a guy and they fall happily ever in love and they live. I mean, that happens and it's great. And I'm here for it because who doesn't love a romance? But there's so much more to this book. So we're going to take some time now to have a little look at the story of Ruth, what she gets up to, and how she hears from God. So the book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges. It's not a great time. And basically what that means is Israel and God are in this kind of on-again, off-again relationship. And God is not very happy with Israel most of the time. And at the start of Ruth, in fact, there's a famine in Israel, and so this guy called Elimelech and his wife Naomi and his sons decide to go to Moab because there's nothing really for them in Israel. The sons get married to Ruth and this other chick called Orpah. The sons and the father die, and then Naomi, the mother-in-law, makes this decision to go back to Israel, which is where we kind of get to know Ruth a bit. So Ruth is not obligated at all to go home to Israel with Naomi. In fact, the best thing for her to do in the context of her life is to just go back to Moab, marry some other guy, and continue her life as a Moabite. Because the thing about the Moabites is they were known as the enemy of God. They were a heavily disliked people group when it came to Israel. They are actually cousins, but their ancestry is filled with incest and sin, and so they are very much separated from the people of God. So the fact that Ruth makes a decision to go and live in the land of Israel, commit to God, to Yahweh, who is not her God, to support her mother-in-law Naomi, is a very unusual set of decisions that she's made. And they're risky. But she does it anyway. She goes, she lives in Israel, she does her best to provide for Naomi, and because of her compassion, her kindness, her obedience, even though she's a foreigner, which is repeatedly told to us throughout the book, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, the narrator really wants you to understand that she is the lowest in society, that there is no favor on her when it comes to the Israelites. And yet, she persists. And as a result, she finds favor with a guy called Boaz, who just happens to be a cousin of her father-in-law. And after the harvest, he's been favorable towards her through the harvest. After the harvest, she and Boaz have got like a vibe. And Naomi convinces her to propose, which in my opinion is very 2022. So end of the harvest, she goes to the threshing floor, and she, again, puts herself in a vulnerable position where she then proposes to Boaz. Boaz is in love with her. He thinks this is great, but there's a problem. Ooh. You see, when somebody dies, a man dies, and there's no one to inherit the property or the inheritance or the bits and bobs and stuff, the cousins and close further family members have the opportunity to inherit instead. They're called a redeemer, and what they can do basically is they continue the bloodline for the guy that died. It was very nice. Thing is, Boaz is not the closest relative. There's some other guy, the other guy, that actually has the legal right to be able to do that first. So Boaz is like, don't worry, Ruth, I got this. And he goes and he has a conversation with the other cousin, and he says things like, congratulations on your new Moabite wife. Now all her future children will inherit your stuff. Which, again, is like the worst thing in the mind of Israel because it's a blending of bringing Moab into the family, and that doesn't sound great. So the other cousin is like, no thanks. Do you want to do it? And Boaz is like, well, I guess, if I must. And so then he and Ruth get married, and they have a baby, and they live happily ever after. And their baby, as it happens, turns out to be the grandfather of a guy called David. And so Ruth is intertwined into this family line of royalty. And no one saw that coming. But here's the thing that's really interesting about the book of Ruth. You see, not once in all 4 chapters does God speak. There is no active voice of Yahweh across the whole narrative. Now, as I said before, this is the time of Judges, so God has been very vocal up until this point. So then how does Ruth the Moabite, who worships the foreign gods, who's not from Israel, who is effectively surrounded by people who are grieving or potentially people who are not safe, how does she learn how to be like God, how to follow his instruction? How does she get integrated into the bloodline that leads to Jesus? And thankfully, this is someone we can relate to because we don't hear the audible voice of God either. So even though it seems like God is silent, clearly he's moving. And so it's up to Ruth to look for it.
If you enjoyed this video today, why don't you click subscribe and click on that notification bell to get a notification the next time we upload a video. And if you're new or you've been coming to the C3 Church for a little while now, why don't you find out what your next step might be in the journey of faith? Click on the next step link in the description below to find out what your next step in your journey might be.